They say the worst mistake a cop can make is arresting the wrong person. But what happens when that person turns out to be your boss? What happens when a quiet street becomes the stage for a public unraveling? The day started like any other in Brookfield, Ohio, a suburb painted in soft pastels and quiet expectations. The hedges were trimmed, the sidewalks clean, and the sun, almost too perfect, sat high above a world pretending nothing ever goes wrong here. But beneath the surface, something always simmers. Sergeant Brian Calloway cruised down the street, one hand on the wheel, the other resting lazily on the radio. 2 decades in uniform had taught him everything, or so he thought. To him, this neighborhood didn't need watching. It needed guarding, protecting, filtering. A place where faces unfamiliar to him often earned more than just a second glance. He liked to think of himself as tough, no nonsense, unshakable, a man of instinct. And that day, his instincts locked onto a woman who didn't fit, at least not in the way he thought she should. She was mid-40s, black, athletic. Her pace was steady, her breathing controlled. Sleek running gear, expensive shoes, earbuds in. She didn't glance at him as he drove by, didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge the presence of authority. Most people at least nod when they see a patrol car, that small, submissive gesture that says, "I see you, officer." But not her. She was in her own world, focused, at ease, and somehow, that unnerved him. A silver Tesla sat parked in a driveway just up ahead. Did she come from there? Or was she casing houses? Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she just didn't care. But for Calloway, that kind of confidence, that kind of audacity, demanded questioning. He pulled over. The tires crunched against the curb as he stepped out, placing a firm hand on his duty belt. Not reaching for his weapon, not yet, but making it clear that it was there. That he was here. That she needed to notice him now. She slowed to a stop, tugging out one earbud. Her breath was labored from the jog, but her expression was calm, steady. "Something wrong, officer?" she asked, tone even, unshaken. Calloway narrowed his eyes. "Where are you coming from?" he asked, his voice low, clipped, the kind of tone he'd perfected over the years, the kind that didn't invite backtalk. "Home," she replied simply. "Just getting in my run." "Where's home?" She tilted her head, the first sign of tension slipping into her eyes. "Couple blocks down. Got ID on you." The moment shifted. Her posture tightened only slightly, barely enough to notice. But Calloway noticed. And in his mind, that slight hesitation meant something. A choice was made in that second. A choice rooted in power, perception, and everything simmering just beneath Brookfield's perfect lawns. He thought he was just doing his job. He had no idea he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. And the woman standing in front of him, she wasn't just another jogger, she was a reckoning. There's a moment, quiet, fleeting, when power tries to disguise itself as protection. And that was the moment Simone Daniels knew things were about to shift. She stood there, sweat drying against her skin, heart rate returning to baseline from her jog, but something colder now crept in. Not fear, not yet, but a steady calculation, a knowing. She met the officer's gaze, eyes unwavering. "You pulled over to stop a woman jogging in broad daylight because you think I'm a threat?" she asked, hands planted firmly on her hips. Sergeant Calloway didn't answer. Not directly. His jaw worked a slow grind, his eyes scanning her, face as if searching for something to confirm the suspicion he'd already built in his head. His silence said enough. Simone's question didn't deserve an answer because in his world, it wasn't really a question. It was a challenge, and that was unacceptable. "You got ID on you?" he repeated, this time more pointedly. "No," Simone replied calmly. "I don't carry identification when I jog. I don't need to." Calloway's stance shifted. He squared his shoulders. The authority in his voice thickened. "I'm conducting an investigation." "An investigation?" Simone raised an eyebrow. "Into what exactly?" He motioned subtly with his head toward the house she'd passed, the one with the sleek silver Tesla glinting in the driveway. You were jogging past a home with a high-value vehicle. I had to make sure everything was in order. Simone let out a breathless laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. The Tesla? So now jogging past a nice car is suspicious? Ma'am, I'm not here to debate. You're not here to enforce the law either. She cut in, sharper now. You're here to remind me that people like me don't belong in neighborhoods like this. A long pause. The sun bore down, casting long shadows over the sidewalk. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed. A wind chime rattled in someone's backyard. Normal sounds in a neighborhood that pretended to be normal, but nothing about this was normal. Calloway stepped forward. Still not aggressive, still careful, but deliberate. Show me some identification, he said again, the sentence clipped at the edges. Simone didn't flinch. She reached for her phone. You know what? Let's just call someone who actually understands the law. His eyes tracked her movement. Her fingers tightened around the phone. And that was all it took. In Calloway's mind, the situation had officially escalated. He didn't shout. Didn't warn. He simply moved. One step forward, his hand grabbing her wrist, twisting it behind her back. The shift from calm to chaos happened in a breath. One moment, Simone was standing with dignity. The next, cold steel dug into her wrists, and her body was being turned and restrained, as if she were a danger, not a citizen. What the hell? She shouted, struggling against his grip. You're under arrest for obstruction, Calloway said, as if reading from a cue card, a script he'd recited too many times before. Simone's heart pounded in her ears, not from panic but fury. You're making a mistake, she gritted out, her voice tight but controlled. A very big mistake. Across the street, a man on his porch raised his phone, started recording. A woman watering her plants froze mid-motion. Eyes turned toward the scene, but no one stepped forward. No one spoke. No one interfered. Just a silent audience. Watching, judging, filming. You should have cooperated, Calloway muttered, tightening the cuffs. Simone's breath came sharp through her nose. Her pride burned hotter than the sun on her skin. Still, her voice stayed steady. You don't even know who I am. He didn't answer. He didn't care. In that moment, Calloway thought he had won. Another call. Another suspect. Another situation, neutralized before it could become something real. His grip tightened on her arms as he pressed the radio to his lips. Dispatch, I've got a 1015. Female suspect, refusing to identify herself, requesting transport. His tone was flat, routine, like he was reporting a parking violation. Simone said nothing. But her eyes screamed. She scanned the crowd. Phones were up. Faces were still. No one intervened. Not yet. But she knew this script. Knew how quickly things could spiral. How many lives had been pulled into patrol cars, cuffed, labeled, uncooperative for simply questioning authority. How many names never made the news. And yet here she was. Another black woman on a sidewalk, arrested for existing. The handcuffs gleamed under the summer sun like warning lights. The cool steel bit into her wrists as she stood restrained in a neighborhood that didn't want to believe this could happen here. Her breathing slowed. Not from fear, but from precision. From control. Her voice dropped, just above a whisper, meant only for him. This is the biggest mistake of your life, Sergeant. He didn't respond. He was too busy asserting control, too blinded by uniform bias and the illusion of authority. He thought he was in charge, but Simone wasn't just anybody. And Calloway? He was about to find out the hard way. The camera phones kept recording, the sun kept shining, and the cuffs, they kept digging in. The street had gone still, thick with a kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful. It felt loaded, like the calm before a verdict. Sergeant Calloway stood over Simone, his hands still gripping the cuffs like they were the last anchor to his authority. But something in the air was shifting. Not just the eyes watching, not just the cameras recording. Something deeper. Unease. Discomfort. A crack in the script he thought he was writing. "Dispatch repeat," he said into the radio, trying to steady himself. "One female in custody. Suspect remains uncooperative." That's when a voice cut through the air like a scalpel. "Excuse me, officer. What's going on here?" Calloway turned his head, instantly annoyed by the interruption. A man was standing on the sidewalk, well-dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, his jacket folded casually over one shoulder. He looked to be in his early 50s, salt and pepper beard, posture straight, voice clear and calm but commanding. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stay back," Calloway said, reflexive. The man didn't budge. "I'm not here to interfere," he said, eyes flicking between Simone and the cuffs around her wrists. "I'm asking a question. Why is this woman in handcuffs?" "She was uncooperative," Calloway repeated. "Refused to show ID." The man tilted his head like he'd just heard something absurd. "She refused to show ID while jogging?" Simone, still breathing hard but not broken, let out a sharp exhale. "He stopped me while I was on my morning run. Said I looked suspicious. I told him I didn't need to carry ID, and now here we are." The man looked back at Calloway, his face unreadable, but the shift was clear. He wasn't asking anymore. He was waiting. And just behind him, murmurs rippled through the crowd that had started to grow. Voices whispered. Phones stayed trained. You could feel it. Something was coming. Then came the low hum of tires on pavement. Smooth, controlled, intentional. A black SUV, tinted windows, unmarked plates. The kind of vehicle that didn't belong to a nosy neighbor or a good Samaritan. It belonged to someone who didn't need to announce themselves, because their presence did the talking. The SUV pulled to a stop just behind the patrol car. For a moment, no one moved. The doors stayed shut. The world held its breath. Then the driver's side door opened. Out stepped Captain Ronald Briggs. Calloway's stomach twisted the second he saw him. Briggs didn't yell, didn't raise a hand. He simply walked. Straight, fast, focused, his eyes locked like heat-seeking missiles on Calloway. The crowd instinctively parted, the man in the suit stepping aside as Briggs stopped just feet from the unfolding scene. Calloway instinctively straightened his posture, but it didn't help. Nothing could prepare him for what was coming. Briggs's voice was quiet but carried like thunder. "Uncuff her." Calloway blinked. "Sir?" I said, "Uncuff her. Now." Confusion flickered across Calloway's face. His fingers hesitated on the cuffs. This didn't make sense. His boss, his commanding officer, was ordering him to let a suspect go. That wasn't protocol, that wasn't standard. "Sir?" Calloway tried again, voice unsure. She refused to identify herself. Briggs cut him off with a sharp glance. "Do you even know who you just put in handcuffs?" Everything stopped. Calloway froze. The crowd stilled. Even the air felt like it folded in on itself, waiting for an answer that wouldn't come. Simone didn't wait. She stood straight, her voice calm, razor sharp. "My name is Chief Simone Daniels." Calloway didn't breathe. She let it hang there. Let the weight of her name crash into the space like a freight train. Then, quieter, but somehow louder than everything before it, she added, "And you just arrested your boss." The silence was louder than any siren. Calloway's mouth went dry. His eyes darted around, looking for an out, a reason, anything that would make this not real. But the faces watching weren't moving. The phones kept recording. And his hands were still on the cuffs around her wrists. She was no longer just a jogger, no longer a suspect. She was the highest-ranking officer in the department, and he had humiliated her, in broad daylight, on camera, surrounded by neighbors, with no cause, no crime. Just the weight of his assumption and the confidence that he would never be questioned. "Sir," he started again, but even he didn't know what was coming next. Briggs took one step forward. "Handcuffs, off, now." This time, Calloway didn't hesitate. His fingers fumbled at the lock. The metal clicked open. Simone pulled her arms forward slowly, rotating her wrists. Red marks ringed her skin, glaring against the sunlight. She didn't look at Calloway, not yet. Briggs stepped beside her, his voice softer. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" Simone shook her head once. "I'm fine." Calloway couldn't look away. Couldn't hide. The cameras were still on him. The moment was still swallowing him. He had misread the entire situation from start to finish. But more than that, he had revealed himself, exposed something he'd never meant to show. Simone turned to face him at last. Her eyes were calm, steady, but different. She wasn't just angry. She was in control. "You think your badge gives you the right to stop whoever you want?" she asked, voice quiet but firm, like steel sliding from a sheath. Calloway swallowed, but said nothing. "You think jogging while black is a crime?" "Nothing. Not a word. You looked at me and saw a threat. Not a person, not a colleague, not your superior. A threat." She took a step closer. He didn't move. "You put your hands on me. You made a choice. And that choice says more about you than that badge ever could." She leaned in, her voice just for him now. "How many others have you done this to?" That question, that one, cut deeper than anything else. Because the answer, somewhere inside him, wasn't zero. It never was. And now, for the first time in his career, the cuffs weren't on someone else. They were on him, not literally, but in every way that mattered, and everyone saw it. The air was electric, but no one moved. Captain Briggs stood still, back straight, arms loose at his sides, not threatening, but unyielding. His voice cut the silence, low, but absolute. "Sergeant Calloway, you're relieved of duty. Effective. Immediately." A ripple went through the crowd. Phones didn't lower, eyes didn't blink. "Hand over your badge and your weapon," Briggs added, his tone like cold steel dragged across concrete. Calloway blinked slowly, as if waking up from a dream he thought he controlled. His hands hovered over his belt. The badge that had once been his shield, his pride, suddenly weighed heavier than it ever had before. He looked down at it like it was foreign, something that no longer belonged to him. Maybe it never had. The silence dragged, thick and punishing. Simone stood nearby, her arms now free, wrists still lined with red from the cuffs. She didn't smirk, didn't gloat. Her face was unreadable, not cold, not cruel, just disappointed. That hurt more than rage ever could. Finally, Calloway unpinned his badge. The metal caught a glint of sun as he placed it carefully into Briggs's open palm. Next came the gun, slow, methodical. He handed it over with a steady hand, even though everything inside him felt like it was fracturing. The weight of that, surrender, was heavier than a firing. It was a stripping, not just of tools but of identity, of certainty. The crowd remained silent, reverent almost, as if watching the final act of a tragedy unfold. And in a way, they were. Simone looked at Calloway for a long time, not to make him squirm, not to shame him, but because she had to say something. Not for him, but for everyone watching. "You need to take a long, hard look at yourself, Sergeant," she said, her voice quiet but piercing. "Because after today, everything changes." Calloway didn't respond. What could he say? That it was a mistake? That he didn't mean it? That he didn't know? But he had meant it, in the moment. And that was the truth that cut the deepest. Simone exhaled slowly, then turned her eyes toward the gathering of neighbors. The same people who had watched her get handcuffed for jogging now looked at her not with pity or doubt, but with clarity. With respect. She wasn't a suspect anymore. She was their chief, a leader, someone who had just lived the worst-case scenario in her own department and handled it with the kind of restraint that many in her position might not have found. One woman, near a mailbox, placed a hand over her chest. Another lowered her phone finally, not because the story was over, but because the truth had already been captured. Calloway, meanwhile, stood frozen, unarmed in every way. As Simone walked past him, calm, composed, unshaken, he couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes again. But she paused just long enough beside him to whisper something only he could hear. "How many others have you done this to?" Her words didn't land like an accusation. They landed like a diagnosis. She didn't wait for a response. There didn't need to be one. Everyone already knew the answer. Briggs gave Calloway a nod. Not of respect, but finality. The kind of nod that ends a chapter. "Go home," he said. Calloway turned without a word. His steps were slow, robotic. He climbed into his cruiser like someone climbing into a coffin. The engine was off. The street was silent. And for the first time in a long time, the man who believed he stood for the law wasn't sure where. He stood at all. Inside the car, he stared down at his hands. They trembled slightly, not from fear, from recognition. He could still feel the ghost of the cuffs in his fingers, the tension, the snap of cold metal around the wrists of a woman who outranked him, who had done nothing wrong, who had jogged past a Tesla on a sunny morning. That's all it took. One look, one assumption, one action, and the story flipped. He looked up at the same sidewalk where it all went down, the same street that, just an hour ago, felt like familiar territory. Now it felt foreign, like a battlefield where he'd been defeated, not by force but by truth. He'd always believed he acted by instinct, that his experience made him right. That suspicion was enough. That uncooperative was a valid excuse to override someone's dignity. But today, instinct had betrayed justice. Today, suspicion had exposed something uglier than a mistake. It had exposed a pattern, a mindset, a system. Calloway watched as Simone stepped into the black SUV. Captain Briggs stood beside it, watching the neighborhood, watching the crowd, watching him. No words were exchanged now. Everything had already been said. The SUV pulled away. Calloway followed it with his eyes until the taillights disappeared into the distance. And then, he was alone. He rested his hands on the steering wheel, staring forward. The world hadn't ended. But his world? It cracked in places that couldn't be easily repaired. A year ago, he would have had an explanation for all of it. She was difficult. She didn't cooperate. She gave me attitude. She fit the profile. But now, those excuses felt like ash on his tongue. Maybe he hadn't been enforcing the law. Maybe he'd been defending something else entirely, something unspoken, unchallenged, until today. For the first time in his life, Calloway realized, justice isn't about who holds power. It's about how that power is used. And today, that power had been misused and weighed by him. The camera phones might stop recording. The neighbors might go inside. The department might move on. But he wouldn't. Not yet. Because the real punishment wasn't losing the badge. It was living with what that badge had come to mean in his hands, and for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't sure he deserved to wear it. The crowd had drifted away. One by one, they lowered their phones, whispered to their neighbors, and disappeared behind front doors and porch screens. The sun hadn't moved much, but the day felt older, heavier, the kind of weight that doesn't come from time but from consequence. Calloway remained in the front seat of his cruiser, staring straight ahead. The engine was off, but his mind was racing. Hands resting loosely on the wheel, fingers curled like they still remembered the feel of the cuffs he'd fastened, too fast, too confidently, around Simone Daniels' wrists. She was gone now. The black SUV had vanished down the block like a shadow folding into light, but her voice still echoed. Her face. The moment. It all looped in his head, louder than any siren. "You just arrested your boss." Those words hadn't just knocked the air out of him. They had taken the ground from beneath his feet. Only an hour ago, this street had felt like his. Familiar. Routine. The hedges, the driveways, the rhythms of a quiet community under his watch. He was the law here. Or so he'd believed. And now? Now he wasn't sure if he ever truly understood what that meant. He looked around. Nothing had physically changed. The lawns were still trimmed. A sprinkler hissed in the distance. But everything felt different. It was like he had been unplugged from a world he once belonged to, cast out by a truth he couldn't unsee. A year ago, he thought, I would have justified all of this. He would have filled out the report like he always did, labeled her non-compliant, logged her refusal to produce ID, claimed he was operating out of caution, not bias. And no one would have questioned it, because the system didn't. But today, I don't know. That admission alone terrified him more than any reprimand, because doubt wasn't something he allowed, not in others, and never in himself. He finally looked up at the street one last time, eyes scanning the sidewalks like he might find the version of himself he'd been that morning, still driving, still confident, still sure. But that man was gone. The badge was gone, and the meaning behind it, forever tainted. Voiceover fades in, soft but cutting. This wasn't just about one man's mistake. It was about a system that let him believe he couldn't be wrong, a culture that rewarded assumption, that applauded instinct over accountability. Today, Simone Daniels didn't just walk away uncuffed. She walked away as proof that power can be challenged, and that silence can be broken. But this story isn't over. Because Simone Daniels didn't just stop one bad arrest, she exposed a crack in the department's foundation. She pulled back the curtain, and what's behind it might be worse. Stay tuned for part 2. The department knew. Comment: if you believe power should be held accountable, like and subscribe to follow Chief Simone's next move. The truth hasn't even started unraveling yet.